My first introduction to the idea of empire probably was watching Shirley Temple in the 1939 film The Little Princess. In the movie, loosely based on the book published in 1905 as an expansion of a short story from 1887, a little girl is left at a boarding school when her widower father, a captain in the British Army, leaves to serve in the Second Boer War. She celebrates in the street when Mafeking is relieved, gains an ally in the potentially magical Indian servant of the recluse living next door, and loses and regains her father. Add to that the multi-ethnic dance included with the song Portobello Road in Disney's Bedknobs and Broomsticks, partially representing the extent of the former British Empire, now a Commonwealth as the movie is set during the Second World War, and you can imagine the romanticized and somewhat fanciful image of the British Empire I had as a child. But we all know that the idea and expression of empire is not at all what appears in films marketed to young viewers. During the past year, I became curious about how the idea of empire, specifically the British Empire, was depicted in atlases published in Great Britain during the British Imperial Century. I sought to examine atlas contents, geographical coverage, order, inclusion of indications of empire in the context of a growing, stable, or devolving British Empire. Britain has been in the business of empire for centuries. In 1169, Britain began expanding into Ireland. British power waxed and waned in Ireland until reconquest occurred in 1603 under James I. Reconquest began in 1536 and occurred in parallel to England's expansion into the Americas. The First British Empire, with an ill-defined beginning between 1583 and 1714, depending on the scholar, and generally agreed upon as ending in 1783, focused initially on the Americas. The largest exception to this geographical focus began in 1612, when the English established their first Indian settlement for commercial enterprise in Surat. Great Britain turned much more attention to the East beginning in 1763, after the defeat of the French in the 7 Years' War. Sometime referred to as World War I, the 7 Years' War was fought on 5 continents between 2 multinational coalitions led by Great Britain and France. The defeat of the French-led coalition resulted in exchanges of territories and created a worldwide power vacuum that Great Britain stepped into. The end of the First British Empire came at the close of the American Revolution, when Great Britain lost a large part of its North American territory. This is not to say that Great Britain suffered because of the loss of the United States. It retained control of important economic areas such as islands in the Caribbean. The Second British Empire is the period between 1783 and 1815, bounded by the ends of 2 wars, the American Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. During this period, Great Britain solidified its identity as a leading Navy power, colonized Australia, and continued to develop commercial ties in South Asia. The Imperial Century is generally considered to be the period between 1815, the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and 1914, the beginning of World War I. The defeat of Napoleon further consolidated Great Britain's position as the leading international superpower, without any serious rivals to its expansion, except for Russia in Central Asia. Think of the Great Game in Kipling's Kim. Great Britain expanded its direct control over territory, India during the first half of the century and Africa during the second, and indirect control over other nations through trade and diplomacy. The growth of this control can be traced through world maps and atlases published in Great Britain. Maps of the British Empire typically exhibit common elements: Mercator projection, Greenwich-centered, territories in red or pink. The combination of Mercator projection and Greenwich center places Britain at the heart of the map. The uniform color employed to highlight both Great Britain and its territories not only brings the worldwide expanse of the empire to the foreground, but also obscures how small the governing entity was. Walter Crane's Imperial Federation map showing the extent of the British Empire in 1886 could be the apogee of imperial maps. Published the year before Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee and during the Colonial and Indian Exhibition, a showcase that took place in London to display the connections in and development of the empire, Crane's map employs the common elements of imperial maps and additionally connects territories with a web of trade and transportation routes and is ornamented with depictions of indigenous peoples and colonists. The graphic on the right appeared in the accompanying article and shows the difference in area between Great Britain and its dependencies and colonies. Looking for empire, thus far I have examined 37 atlases that were commercially published in Great Britain between 1794 and 1922. I counted, making sure to count consistently within each atlas, the number of images of the world, Europe, Asia, Africa, North America, South America, and Oceania and Australia. I also counted some subunits, West Indies, India, and Great Britain. I considered counting pages of text and the amount of non-cartographic graphics for each area, but found that atlases which included letterpress and any embedded graphs and illustrations were few and far between in this small sample. Still, this is something that I would like to return to. Nearly all the atlases were composed of regional map sheets, maps of continents or geographically identifiable areas, rather than cellular map sheets, large regions divided into conveniently sized quadrangles that do not have established regional identities. After counting, percentages of total context were calculated for each area. I had imagined that as the century progressed and there was a greater interest in India and Africa, that the percentage of atlas space devoted to those continents would increase. That does not seem to be the case when looking at the graph of geographical coverage for all of the examined atlases. In fact, there seems to be no discernible pattern at all. Perhaps this is because of the regional nature of the maps and the atlases. Most of the atlases devote the largest percentage of coverage to Europe, and the earliest atlases do not include Oceania or Australia. Generally, coverage of South America is very limited and occasionally non-existent, perhaps due in part to British Guiana often being included in maps of the West Indies or the Antilles. The gross percentage of coverage devoted to the 6 named continent regions obscures the level of attention paid to smaller subregions such as Great Britain itself, the West Indies, and India. These areas can be looked at in 2 ways, as a percentage of the entire atlas and as a percentage of continental coverage. When looking at the percentage of the total atlas, Great Britain averages 12%. One atlas did not include Great Britain as a separate. The West Indies, 3%. 4 atlases did not include the West Indies as separate, and India, 5%. 1 did not include India as a separate. The story changes a little bit when comparing these breakout areas with the coverage of their containing continents. Great Britain averages 36% of the European coverage. 2 did not include any European coverage other than Great Britain. The West Indies, 24% of North American coverage. West Indies was at least half of North American coverage in 6 atlases. And India, 37% of the Asian coverage. India was 100% of the Asian coverage in 3 atlases. It appears that for some publishers, the subunit was more important than establishing continental context. I noted some coverage abnormalities, seemingly driven by audience or expected use. For instance, the 1896 Church Missionary Atlas does not include any maps of Europe or South America. The overwhelming majority are for Asia or Africa. Not surprising given the context of time, publisher, and expected readers. Generally, the convention of red or pink representing British possessions holds true except for one map where pink represents Church Missionary Society districts. The 2 world maps included in Stockdale's Atlas to Crutwell's Gazetteer, published in 1808, both indicate explorers' tracks. The hemispheric depiction, not shown here, appears to show a wider national variety of ships, but without any kind of legend, while the map on the Mercator projection focuses on British ships and explicitly identifies 4 voyages in the legends, 3 led by James Cook to the Pacific, and the 4th led by Constantine John Phipps in an unsuccessful attempt to discover the Northwest Passage. On that voyage, Horatio Nelson serves as a midshipman on the Carcass. While not overtly a map of empire, the map on the Mercator projection could be viewed as expressing British knowledge and thus extrapolated to control or influence. On the South America map, the Falkland Islands and British Guiana are both outlined in red. There does not seem to be a deliberate use of red to indicate British territory on the West Indies, Asia, or Africa continental maps, but there may be on the map of Hindustan. Nowhere in the volume does a legend indicate that red is affiliated with British holdings. Like the 1808 Stockdale, Errol Smith's 1817 New General Atlas contains both a double hemisphere map and a Mercator projection of the world. Neither map appears to make any kind of territorial claims via color or exploration tracks. Although the meaning of pink is not indicated through a legend or other statement anywhere in the atlas, the map of West Indies clearly employs pink to designate British holdings. This is not so clear elsewhere in the atlas. British North America, aka Canada, is outlined in pink, but strangely, all of India and all of Africa are outlined in pink too. On the map of Oceania, the east coast of Australia is pink, and the rest of the continent's coastline is in yellow. But on the plate that focuses solely on Australia, the entire coastline is in pink. Unfortunately, I could not find a British cartoon that fit. Making a large leap forward in time, during the last quarter of the 19th century, political, economic, social, and popular interest in the empire, both in Great Britain and elsewhere in the empire, increased. The empire was seen as being greatly important to Great Britain's economic success. Other countries, in particular Germany, were expanding their spheres of influence. Africa became an area of heightened interest and was partitioned by European powers purely for economic advancement without consideration for indigenous peoples, cultures, or governance. A number of atlases focusing purely on the British Empire supported this wave of imperial interest. The Queen and Her Empire, published in 1900 and followed by King Edward VII and His Empire in 1905, has a fairly small map section, 16 maps, in comparison to the accompanying 87 black and white photographs arranged in two sections, Beautiful Britain and Broader Britain. The atlas's initial map of the world of the British Isles is followed by a bright two-page map highlighting the empire, which is simply titled World. The world map appears to be a Mercator-like projection and uses red to indicate empire territories, but is not centered on Greenwich. Instead, it is centered on 90 degrees west, placing a northerly stretched Canada in the center. Pink is used throughout the atlas to indicate the British Empire, but is only specifically attributed on the map of India. On maps such as those for portions of Australia or New Zealand, pink is included as a state-level color. When I was first looking at this atlas, I thought I had already looked at it. The maps seemed familiar. Of course they were, as they had been created and copyrighted by Rand McNally. The 1905 version used maps by the London Geographical Society and George Phillip. With a smaller single-page map of the empire, a map section decreased to only 12 maps, and the photograph sections increased to 101 photos. The 1909 Data Dense Atlas by William Bissiker, The British Empire and Japan, its features, resources, commerce, industries, and scenery, together with the physical and economic conditions of the world on an illustrated descriptive atlas, is an odd publication. There are many thematic world maps, sometimes as many as 8 on a 2-page spread. A fairly typical map of the British Empire is included with lots of statistical charts at the bottom. The interesting point about the empire map is that different statuses within the empire, colony, protectorate, sphere of influence, are differentiated. And the idea that the empire wraps completely around the globe is reinforced by the graphic repeat of Australia. The parts of the British Empire are uniformly treated using a cookie-cutter format that includes for each area political and relief maps, summer and winter climate maps, maps showing vegetable, mineral, and animal products and industries, general statistical and historical information, and photographs of indigenous people, animals, and scenery. Strangely, Japan is treated exactly as if it was part of the British Empire. The coverage for the Japanese Empire is the same size and layout as that for India, South Africa, or the West Indies. In 1909, Great Britain had strong diplomatic ties with Japan, but the coverage included in this atlas hardly reflects the sphere of influence Japan had in Asia during the early 20th century. Representation of the British Empire continued to appear in atlases published after the First World War and the end of the Imperial Century. The Mercator projection map included in the 1920 Harmsworth Atlas of the World and Pictorial Gazetteer is titled The World, showing the British Empire. It uses pink to include British holdings and has been updated from the British Empire map that appeared in the 1908 Harmsworth Atlas to show changes in territorial control after the war. Pink is also used on a separate political map of the world without definition. The first map plate in the atlas shows a trio of maps with legend illustrating the growth of the British Empire, as well as other empires between 1715 and 1830, the British Empire in red, the French Empire in blue. As for the remainder of the maps in the atlas, perhaps the editors assumed that atlas readers would know generally that pink represented British holdings, for on the map of India, the only color note is native states, colored yellow. There is full color reference on the general map of Africa, which includes an inset map using the same color scheme showing European possessions in Africa, 1914. Color convention knowledge seems to be applied, but not documented on the regional African coverage that follows, as well as on the continental coverage of North America. Just for the novelty, the most recent atlas I examined was the 1922 Atlas of the British Empire, published by Stanford. The original was included in the 200-book library of Queen Mary's Doll's House, which was built and furnished at a scale of approximately 1 inch to a foot. The atlas contains 12 maps. The world showing the British Empire, described just as the world in the table of contents, highlights the empire in red, true red, not pink. Red, although a rather pinky red, is employed inconsistently on regional maps. Sometimes it is explicitly identified as the color of British possessions, and other times it is used to indicate British possessions without explanation. A purplish color, very close to pink, also appears. It appears that the subtle difference between the pink of British possession and the purplish pink of other areas is that British territories are pink with a darker pink or red outline. My sampling of 37 atlases is just a small portion of the list that I've compiled of likely publications to examine. Through a simple catalog search for atlases British, I found over 430 possible titles in the state of Illinois. I know that this could be a low count because 10 of the atlases that I examined from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign collection did not include atlases British as a subject heading. So what have I found thus far? Red has been used to demark British-held territory since at least 1808. I need to decide how far back to continue to look. I found on a map of the Americas in Payne's 1794 atlas to accompany his new system of universal geography a color legend, although the color list does not seem to have used orange as dictated, and Canada, Jamaica, and British Guiana all outlined in red. More often than not, I found that cartographers or atlas publishers rarely explicitly indicate color use. Frequently, a color key only appears on maps of India, buried in the latter part of the volume and keyed specifically to that region. On world maps, earlier atlases seem to tend towards showing continents in single colors rather than countries or possessions. The 1808 Kerr's new universal atlas is a little bit different, including a Mercator projection with continental color blocks and a double hemisphere world that somewhat indicates British possessions in red, although red is used elsewhere. This was the earliest example in my small sample to show British possessions uniformly in red on a world map. The use of vocabulary also varies. The aforementioned 1794 Payne Atlas uses the word English in a legend. This later becomes British, British possessions, or British territory. The first instance of British Empire that I found was in the 1853 Descriptive Atlas of Astronomy and of Physical and Political Geography by Milner and Peterman. And the earliest world map titled British Empire was in Swanson's Companion Atlas to the Gazetteer of the World, published circa 1860. This presages Great Britain's age of new imperialism and the publication of atlases devoted solely to illustrating the geography of British Empire. Thank you very much.